January 15, 1943. Minus 32 degrees Celsius. Frozen steppe 12 kilometers southwest of Stalingrad. Guards Lieutenant Dmitri Lavrinenko, crouched beside his T-34 476, watching frost crystals form on the steel hull as his breath condensed in the pre-dawn darkness. Around him, 19 Soviet tanks sat silent in the killing cold, engines off to conserve precious fuel. Crews huddled inside, trying to stay warm enough to function when battle came. Somewhere beyond the ridge to the west, German reconnaissance had reported Panzer IVs moving to counterattack Soviet positions that had finally pushed the invaders back from the Volga's edge. "Start engines," came the order over battalion radio at 0540 hours. Lavrinenko climbed into his commander's cupola, tapping his driver's shoulder through the hatch. Below, Senior Sergeant Viktor Petrov hit the starter. The V2 diesel engine turned over once, groaned, then died with a mechanical cough that sounded like surrender. The fuel had gelled to the consistency of mud. Petrov tried again, the battery voltage dropping with each desperate attempt. Nothing. Through the grey morning murk, Lavrinenko watched other T-34 commanders experiencing identical failures. Tanks that had fought brilliantly yesterday refused to start in temperatures that defeated Soviet engineering. Of 20 tanks in his company, only 4 engines caught and held. The rest sat immobile, useless steel sculptures in the snow. The radio crackled with mounting panic. German armor approaching from the west. Approximately 5 kilometers. All units engage immediately. But 3/4 of Lavrinenko's company couldn't move. Crews scrambled out with blowtorches, desperately trying to heat oil pans frozen solid. Others hand-cranked starting mechanisms until their arms went numb. The Germans were 20 minutes away and closing. Then Lavrinenko heard different engines, higher pitched than Soviet diesels, distinctly foreign, coming from behind Soviet lines. From the direction of the supply depot, through the blue twilight emerged shapes that seemed wrong. Too tall, too boxy, silhouettes that belonged in American newsreels, rather than the frozen Russian steppe. 21 tanks in a precise column, their angular forms unmistakable even at distance. American-built M4A2 Sherman tanks, delivered through Lend-Lease just 3 weeks earlier, still wearing the olive-drab paint from Detroit factories. Lavrinenko had heard about these machines. Soviet tank crews called them MK, a Russian pronunciation of M4, spoken with the contempt reserved for foreign charity. American tanks, built by factory workers who'd never heard artillery fire, who'd never fought. Too tall, offering German gunners perfect targets. Too wide for Russian roads. Gasoline engines that would burn like torches. Crew comforts, like padded seats that real tankers considered weakness masquerading as sophistication. The Americans arrive, Lavrinenko's gunner muttered, watching the Shermans pass their position. Let's see how capitalist luxury performs in real Russian winter. But every single Sherman engine was running. 21 tanks, 21 operational power plants, moving with mechanical confidence through temperatures that had paralyzed battle-tested Soviet armor. The lead Sherman's commander, a Soviet captain named Alexei Berda, who'd been assigned to these American kindergarten machines against his protests, gave Lavrinenko a casual salute as his column rolled past the immobilized. Lavrinenko felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with temperature. Embarrassment, resentment, and underneath both, the uncomfortable stirring of doubt about assumptions he'd carried since these foreign tanks arrived. The Sherman column crested the ridge and disappeared toward the sound of approaching German armor. Lavrinenko's crew continued their desperate attempts to start their engine, but he couldn't stop watching the ridge where the American tanks had vanished. The battle would be fought by the machines they'd dismissed as inferior toys. Exactly 3 weeks earlier, Lavrinenko had stood in a muddy rail yard outside Moscow, watching American tanks being unloaded from flat cars that had traveled from Murmansk. Soviet officers gathered to inspect the Lend-Lease equipment, and the consensus formed immediately. Major Konstantin Volkov shook his head at the Sherman's height. The fascists will see these coming from 3 kilometers. What were the Americans thinking? Another officer pointed at the rubber track blocks instead of solid steel. These will fail in our mud. American engineers don't understand Russian conditions. The five-man crew was criticized as wasteful, when the T-34's four-man arrangement worked perfect. The radio in every tank was dismissed as unnecessary, when most Soviet tanks operated without them. Lavrinenko himself had climbed inside a Sherman during that inspection. The spacious interior shocked him. So much room compared to the T-34's cramped fighting compartment. Padded seats, excellent visibility through well-designed periscopes, controls that seemed built for human comfort rather than mechanical efficiency. This is a tank for parades, he'd told his crew that evening over vodka. Not for war. Americans build soft machines for soft soldiers. Now, listening to German engines growing louder while his T-34 remained frozen, Lavrinenko wondered if he'd misjudged everything. The sound of gunfire erupted from beyond the ridge, the distinctive crack of 75mm guns, different from Soviet weapons. Through his binoculars, Lavrinenko spotted the 1st Panzer IV cresting the high ground, its long-barreled gun traversing toward Soviet position. Behind it came more, a full company of German armor, 8 tanks advancing with the confident precision of predators who dominated this battlefield for 18 months. The Shermans didn't hesitate. The first shot came so quickly, Lavrinenko barely saw the muzzle flash. The lead Panzer IV jerked to a stop, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Before the other German tanks could react, more Shermans fired. The coordination was remarkable, each tank engaging separate targets. No wasted shots. Radio communication allowing instant tactical adjustment that Soviet forces rarely achieved. Within 90 seconds, 3 German tanks were burning. The remaining 5 scattered, trying to use terrain for cover, but the Sherman commanders, sitting high in their tall turrets with excellent visibility, tracked every movement. More shots, more hits. The German counterattack that should have overwhelmed the undermanned Soviet position collapsed in under 3 minutes. Lavrinenko watched in stunned silence as the American-built tanks systematically destroyed German armor while his own T-34 sat frozen and useless. The kindergarten machines had just saved the Soviet position. The tanks he'd mocked as inferior had fought when Soviet tanks couldn't even start. His driver finally coaxed their engine to life, 35 minutes too late to matter. As they moved forward through positions now secured by Sherman tanks, Lavrinenko saw Captain Berda standing in his turret, calmly directing recovery operations. The American tank's engine still purred smoothly despite extreme cold, despite combat, despite everything that had defeated Soviet engineering. The radio crackled. All T-34 commanders, battalion commander, the fascists are retreating. American equipment performed satisfactorily. The word hung in the frozen air like an admission of something nobody wanted to speak aloud. Lavrinenko looked at his immobilized company, at the Shermans that had saved them, and felt the first crack in his certainty about Soviet superiority. For the first time since receiving his Guards designation for bravery at Moscow, Dmitri Lavrinenko questioned whether the T-34 he loved represented the pinnacle of tank design. The evidence suggested otherwise, and that realization, more than the cold or the close call with German armor, shook him to his core. The American tanks they'd laughed at 3 weeks ago had just demonstrated something undeniable. When temperatures dropped low enough, Soviet excellence became Soviet immobility. American luxury became American victory, and the tankers who'd built their identity on toughness and deprivation had been saved by machines they'd considered too soft for real war. The sun rose over Stalingrad's ruins, illuminating a battlefield where frozen Soviet tanks surrounded operational American ones. The mathematics of that morning would spread through the Red Army's tank corps like the cold that had caused it. Questions would be asked, assumptions would be challenged, and the Sherman tanks that Soviet crews had dismissed would begin to earn a different reputation entirely. But standing beside his finally running T-34, watching German positions burn from Sherman fire, Lavrinenko understood what others would learn over the coming months. The Americans hadn't sent charity. They'd sent a lesson wrapped in steel about what happened when engineering met ideology. when reliability trumped reputation, when industrial democracy built better war machines than totalitarian urgency. The lesson was just beginning. The contempt had begun 4 months earlier, in September 1942, when the first American tanks arrived at Murmansk aboard Allied convoy ships that had survived the gauntlet of German U-boats and air attacks. Soviet tank officers gathered at the Arctic port watched with open skepticism as M4A2 Shermans were unloaded, massive angular machines that looked nothing like the T-34s they'd come to worship as instruments of Soviet genius. Major General Yakov Fedorenko, inspector of Red Army Armored Forces, circled the first Sherman to reach his inspection yard, his expression hardening with each observation. "The Americans have sent us their factory rejects," he announced to his staff. "This is what happens when capitalists build tanks: excess where there should be efficiency, waste where there should be purpose." The criticisms flowed immediately and spread through Soviet tank units like winter frost. The Sherman stood 9 feet tall compared to the T-34's 8 feet. An extra 12 inches that would draw German fire and make concealment difficult in the flat Russian terrain. It weighed 30 tons against the T-34's 26, additional mass that Soviet officers assumed would bog down in notorious Russian mud or break through weakened bridges. The armor was vertical rather than sloped, abandoning the revolutionary deflection principles that made the T-34 so survivable. Most damning was the 5-man crew when the T-34 had proven 4 men sufficient, wasting a soldier who could be fighting elsewhere. Senior commanders reinforced the prejudices systematically. Colonel Ivan Lebedev, a tank warfare instructor at the Kazan Tank School, addressed newly assigned Sherman crews in October 1942 with barely concealed disdain. "The American tank is designed by men who have never experienced battle. They think war is uncomfortable, so they add padding to seats. They think tankers need conversation, so they waste resources on radios for every vehicle. They don't understand that real Soviet tankers need only 3 things: armor, gun, and engine. Everything else is capitalist self-indulgence that makes soldiers soft." His students nodded agreement, already dreading their assignments to the foreign machine. The technical specifications seemed to confirm Soviet superiority in every category that mattered. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun appeared inferior to the T-34's 76.2mm F-34 in armor penetration tests. The Continental R9075 radial engine produced only 400 horsepower, compared to the T-34's mighty 500 horsepower diesel. Soviet engineers calculated that their tank was faster, more powerful, better protected through intelligent armor slope, and more efficient in crew utilization. On paper, the American donation seemed like receiving a cart when you'd mastered building automobiles. Soviet propaganda had spent years building national pride around domestic tank production. The T-34 was celebrated as the ultimate expression of Soviet engineering philosophy: simple, brutal, effective, unstoppable. Its sloped armor represented revolutionary thinking that had caught German engineers flat-footed. Its powerful diesel engine could burn almost any petroleum product, even captured German fuel. Its wide tracks conquered mud that stopped panzer divisions cold. Soviet factories were producing T-34s by thousands despite wartime hardships, proof that socialist organization outperformed capitalist chaos. Against this carefully constructed narrative, the American Sherman seemed like admission of weakness rather than gesture of strength. Tank crews assigned to Sherman battalions considered it punishment rather than privilege. Senior Lieutenant Alexei Berda, veteran of desperate fighting at Moscow where his T-34 had killed 3 German tanks in one engagement, was furious when ordered to transition to commanding a Sherman company. "They're sending me to die in an American parade float," he complained bitterly to his battalion commander. "Give me back my T-34. At least I understand its weaknesses. At least I know which failures will kill me." His sentiment echoed through every unit receiving the foreign machines. Soviet tankers had bonded with their T-34s through desperate battles. The tanks had saved their lives, proven themselves in combat, earned absolute trust. The Shermans were unknown, untested, suspicious. Machines built by people who didn't understand the savage arithmetic of the Eastern Front. The training exercises at conversion schools seemed to validate every concern. The Sherman's height made it visible from distances where T-34s could hide behind minor terrain folds. Its wider profile presented a larger target to German gunners who'd become experts at hitting Soviet armor. Crews accustomed to the T-34's brutally cramped interior felt lost in the Sherman's spacious fighting compartment, interpreting the extra room as wasted space rather than operational advantage. The rubber track blocks seemed flimsy compared to solid steel tracks that could smash through obstacles. Most significantly, Soviet tankers couldn't comprehend why Americans wasted resources on crew comfort when the only comfort that mattered was survival. The cultural disconnect ran deeper than mechanical specification. Soviet military doctrine emphasized offensive aggression, speed and shock action above all else. The T-34 embodied this philosophy perfectly: fast, hard-hitting, mass-produced, and explicitly expendable. Soviet commanders expected catastrophic tank losses and planned accordingly, viewing armor as ammunition to be expended achieving objectives. Crew survival was secondary to mission accomplishment. Individual tank quality mattered less than overwhelming numbers. Against this ruthless calculus, the Sherman's design philosophy seemed incomprehensible. Why waste steel on crew comfort when that steel could be armor? Why install radios in every tank when aggressive independent action should be standard? Why make tankers comfortable when discomfort built the toughness that won battles? Political officers reinforced suspicions about American motives during mandatory education sessions. The capitalists send us inferior equipment while keeping superior weapons for themselves, a commissar declared at a November 1942 political meeting, attended by newly assigned Sherman crews. They want Soviet soldiers to bleed fighting fascism, while American factories profit from our desperation. The Sherman is proof that America doesn't truly support the workers' struggle against Hitler. Such messages resonated powerfully with crews already skeptical of Western intention. The Shermans became symbols of supposed American duplicity, appearing generous while actually offloading substandard equipment onto desperate allies. As winter approached in late 1942, Soviet tankers prepared for the brutal cold that defined Eastern Front warfare from November through March. They knew their T-34s would struggle mechanically, fuel would thicken to sludge, batteries would weaken dramatically. Starting engines would become battles against physics, but they had 2 winters of experience developing improvised solutions, building fires under engine compartments, draining fluids at night and reheating them at dawn, keeping engines running continuously during operation. What they didn't know was how American tanks would perform when temperatures dropped below -20°C. Most assumed catastrophic failure. American engines are designed for their moderate climate, predicted a maintenance officer at a technical briefing. In real Russian winter they will freeze completely while our proven diesels continue functioning. The nickname MK emerged during this period, a Russian pronunciation of the M4 designation. Unlike affectionate nicknames Soviet soldiers gave their own equipment, MK was spoken with derision, carrying implications of foreign strangeness and suspected inadequacy. Crews assigned to Sherman battalions endured mockery from T-34, the MK drivers they were called, as if piloting American machines somehow diminished their status as Soviet warriors. Some officers quietly requested transfers back to T-34 units, preferring familiar risks to unknown foreign machines. By January 1943, when Sherman units began deploying to frontline positions around Stalingrad, the dismissal was complete and nearly universal. Soviet tankers had convinced themselves through months of reinforcement that American tanks were inferior in every category that mattered for Eastern Front combat. They expected the Shermans to fail in battle, prove too tall for survival, bog down in winter conditions, and generally validate every negative assumption. The machines built by comfortable American factory workers who'd never experienced real war would crumble when facing the Wehrmacht's battle-hardened panzer forces. and the unforgiving Russian winter. This absolute certainty would survive exactly as long as it took for temperatures to plunge below -30°C, and for German armor to threaten Soviet positions. The prejudice would die in a frozen field southwest of Stalingrad, when the inferior American machines proved they could fight while Soviet tanks could only watch. The contempt that had seemed so justified in September would transform into something more complex by the time January's sun set on Sherman tanks guarding positions their Soviet counterparts couldn't defend. The M4A2 Sherman that saved Soviet positions on January 15th represented the convergence of American industrial capacity and specific engineering decisions made for Lend-Lease production. While the United States Army primarily used gasoline-powered Shermans with Continental R97.5 radial engines, the M4A2 variant was designed specifically for allies with diesel-based logistics, the Soviet Union and British Commonwealth forces. Its twin General Motors 6-71 diesel engines, each producing 18.7 horsepower for a combined 30.75 horsepower output, made it compatible with Soviet fuel supplies and maintenance practices, while offering advantages American planners didn't fully appreciate when specifications were drawn. The Sherman's development had begun in frantic urgency during 1941, as German Panzers dominated European battlefields. American designers at the Aberdeen Proving Ground studied combat reports and concluded that reliability, crew survivability, and mechanical simplicity mattered more than maximum armor or gun power. The result was a tank optimized for mass production and sustained operations rather than technical superiority in individual specifications. The M4A2's twin diesel configuration provided 150 miles operational range, redundancy if one engine failed, and fuel efficiency superior to gasoline variant. The engines were derivatives of General Motors bus and truck power plants, proven designs that could run for thousands of hours between overhauls when maintained properly. American engineers incorporated features that seemed like luxury to Soviet observers, but represented systematic thinking about crew effectiveness. The five-man crew arrangement divided labor efficiently. Commander focused entirely on tactical decisions, gunner concentrated on target engagement, loader handled ammunition without other duties, driver and assistant driver operated the vehicle and hull machine gun. This specialization meant each crew member performed their role more effectively than Soviet tankers who juggled multiple responsibilities. The spacious interior wasn't wasted space, but recognition that exhausted, cramped crews made fatal mistakes. The spring-mounted seats absorbed shock that could concuss crews in vehicles with minimal padding. The excellent visibility through multiple periscopes meant commanders could assess situations without exposing themselves to enemy fire. The radio equipment that Soviet officers dismissed as unnecessary represented perhaps the Sherman's greatest advantage. Every M4A2 delivered to the Soviet Union included an SER 508, or Soviet-compatible radio capable of voice communication at ranges exceeding 8 kilometers. American doctrine assumed that coordinated action multiplied effectiveness more than raw specifications, that 3 tanks working together through radio communication outfought 5 tanks operating independently. Soviet forces, where only 1 in 10 T-34s carried radios and those were often commander-only receivers, were just beginning to understand this principle through bitter experience. German panzer forces coordinating through radio had repeatedly outmaneuvered numerically superior Soviet tank units that communicated through flags and pre-battle plans. The Sherman's armor configuration, criticized for being vertical rather than sloped, was actually thicker than initial assessments suggested. The front hull armor measured 76 mm at 0 degrees, providing protection equivalent to the T-34's 45 mm sloped armor against most German anti-tank weapons. The vertical arrangement simplified production and repairs, while the armor quality itself, American rolled homogeneous steel, proved more consistent than Soviet armor plate, which varied dramatically in quality depending on which factory and which month produced it. The Sherman could be penetrated by German 75 mm and 88 mm guns at combat ranges, but so could the T-34. Neither tank could reliably survive hits from German long-barreled weapons, making operational factors like reliability and crew survival more significant than marginal armor differences. The diesel engines that powered Soviet Lend-Lease Shermans incorporated cold-weather engineering that American designers had developed for Arctic conditions. Each engine included integrated heating systems, advanced battery configurations maintaining charge in extreme cold, and fuel systems designed to function with winterized diesel down to -40 Celsius. The twin-engine arrangement meant that if one engine struggled in cold weather, the other could provide starting power. American engineers had tested these systems in Alaska and northern Canada, conditions closely matching Russian winter, then incorporated lessons learned into production specifications. Soviet T-34 designers, despite 2 winters of Eastern Front experience, had never systematically addressed cold weather starting because their design philosophy emphasized field expedience over engineering solutions. By January 1943, American factories had delivered 2007 M4A2 Shermans to the Soviet Union through the dangerous Arctic convoy route to Murmansk, and the longer but safer route through Iran. Total Lend-Lease Sherman deliveries would eventually reach 4,102 tanks, representing roughly 12% of Soviet tank strength, but concentrated in Guards units and breakthrough formations where their reliability proved most valuable. American production capacity made these deliveries possible without impacting U.S. forces. In 1943 alone, American factories produced 21,245 Sherman tanks of all variants, more than total German tank production for the entire war. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Detroit could produce 20 Shermans daily when operating at capacity, a single factory output exceeding many nations' entire annual production. The maintenance advantages of Sherman tanks would prove as important as their combat performance. Every Sherman was built to standardized specifications with interchangeable parts. A transmission from a tank built in January 1943 would fit perfectly in one built 6 months later. American supply chains provided comprehensive spare parts packages, including complete engine assemblies that could be swapped in field conditions within hours. Technical manuals translated into Russian provided detailed maintenance procedures with clear diagrams. Soviet maintenance crews, accustomed to improvising repairs with whatever materials were available, discovered that American tanks could actually be maintained according to systematic procedures that extended operational life dramatically. The T-34 FRD-76 that Soviet tankers defended so fiercely was indeed a remarkable achievement under Soviet production constraints. Its sloped armor, powerful 76.2 mm gun, wide tracks, and 500 horsepower diesel engine made it superior to most German tanks when introduced in. But by 1943, the T-34's advantages were being undermined by production pressures that forced compromises in quality. Armor plate quality varied wildly between factories. Transmissions frequently failed after minimal use. Vision devices were primitive or absent. Radios were luxury items installed in command vehicles only. Crew ergonomics were deliberately Spartan on the theory that discomfort was irrelevant to combat effectiveness. Most significantly, the T-34 was designed for short operational life. Soviet planners expected each tank to survive an average of 6 months in combat conditions, making long-term reliability unnecessary. Build them quickly, use them aggressively, accept losses, replace them with new production. The Sherman represented opposite design philosophy. Build it well, maintain it properly, keep crews alive, maximize operational availability. American doctrine calculated that a tank spending 85% of its time operational was more valuable than a technically superior tank operational only 50% of the time. The numbers emerging from early 1943 combat validated this philosophy. Sherman battalions maintained 80–85% operational readiness, even in harsh winter conditions. Comparable Soviet T-34 battalions averaged 55–60% operational readiness, with mechanical failures sidelining more tanks than German fire. The gap widened in extreme weather, when T-34 operational rates dropped to 40% while Shermans maintained 75–80% readiness. The Soviet Union's industrial situation in January 1943 made Lend-Lease Shermans more valuable than their specifications suggested. Soviet tank factories evacuated east in 1941, and still recovering from disruption, were producing tanks at maximum capacity, but with declining quality. The Stalingrad tractor factory, one of the largest T-34 producers, lay in ruins after 5 months of urban combat. Remaining factories operated under constant pressure to increase quantity, resulting in shortcuts that reduced reliability. Every Lend-Lease Sherman arriving from America freed Soviet production capacity to focus on quantity, while American quality filled gaps in frontline effectiveness. The German tanks that Shermans faced at Stalingrad were themselves products of competing design philosophies. Panzer IV Alsif-G variants carried superior 75mm Swk-40 guns, and frontal armor upgraded to 80mm. But German production numbered only 1,006 Panzer IVs in all of 1942 versus over 25,000 Soviet tanks, and nearly 50,000 American tanks produced that same year. Germany couldn't match Allied production volume, forcing them to emphasize technical superiority in individual vehicles, a strategy that worked brilliantly in small engagements but couldn't overcome numerical and industrial disadvantages in prolonged warfare. The morning of January 15, 1943, when American-built diesel engines started reliably in -32-degree cold, while Soviet diesels failed, wasn't a fluke of circumstance. It was the predictable result of systematic American engineering applied to a specific problem, validated through Arctic testing, incorporated into production specifications, and delivered through industrial capacity that could afford comprehensive solutions rather than expedient compromises. Soviet tankers witnessing this performance didn't yet understand. They were seeing the output of a society that could simultaneously fight global war, maintain civilian prosperity, and engineer solutions to problems most nations would accept as unchangeable limitations. That understanding would come gradually, through months of operations where American tanks kept running while Soviet tanks sat broken, where American spare parts arrived regularly while Soviet parts were scavenged from casualties, where American engineering proved that reliability was a choice, not luck. January 23, 1943. 8 days after the frozen morning that shattered assumptions, Soviet High Command Forward Observation Post Stalingrad sector. The temperature had climbed to a balmy -18 Celsius, warm enough that engines started with only moderate difficulty, cold enough that the lessons of the previous week remained visceral. Guards Lieutenant Dmitri Lavrinenko stood beside Captain Alexei Berda, watching a mixed formation prepare for offensive operations against German positions, defending the western approaches to the ruined city. 15 T-34s, 12 Shermans, coordinated attack against entrenched panzer positions. Your American machines performed adequately last week, Lavrinenko offered, the closest he could come to admission. Berda, who had fought his way from Moscow to Stalingrad and knew false praise when he heard it, simply nodded. They start when needed. Sometimes that matters more than anything else. The attack began at 0700 hours. Both tank types advanced across frozen steppe toward German positions 2 kilometers distant. Within minutes, the operational difference became undeniable. The Sherman formation maintained precise spacing and coordination, each tank aware of others' positions through radio communication. Commanders called out German anti-tank gun positions, warned of obstacles, coordinated fire without breaking stride. The T-34 formation, with only the company commander's tank carrying a radio, advanced in predetermined formation, unable to adapt when German fire destroyed the command tank 3 minutes into the attack. Lavrinenko watched through binoculars as the leaderless T-34s continued forward, each commander fighting his own battle, unaware of threats his comrades could see, unable to coordinate fire on hardened positions. 3 more T-34s died to anti-tank guns, that concentrated fire on isolated targets. The Shermans, communicating continuously, identified the German gun positions and coordinated suppressive fire while maneuvering to flank them. 2 Shermans were hit, but both crews escaped through the multiple hatches that Soviet tankers had mocked as unnecessary. The 15 T-34s committed, 8 reached German positions. All 12 Shermans arrived intact, having fought as a coordinated unit rather than 12 individual vehicles. The after-action review was conducted in uncomfortable silence. The numbers told a story Soviet doctrine didn't accommodate. Better coordination had proven more valuable than marginally better specifications. Radios in every tank had multiplied combat effectiveness beyond what armor or guns could achieve. The Americans hadn't built luxury features. They'd built force multipliers that Soviet designers had failed to recognize. February 2nd brought the ultimate validation. German forces finally accepting that Stalingrad was lost, attempted a final breakout to avoid encirclement. A reinforced panzer regiment over 40 tanks, including feared Tiger I heavies, struck Soviet positions at dawn. The defense included 2 Soviet tank brigades, one equipped entirely with T-34s, another mixing T-34s with Lend-Lease Sherman. The temperature had dropped again overnight, to -28°C. When the attack came, the T-34 Brigade's commander discovered that 18 of his 32 tanks wouldn't start. The frozen vehicles sat useless while German armor advanced. The mixed brigade, its Sherman component starting reliably, met the German attack with 23 of 25 tanks operational. The Sherman operational rate 92%. The pure T-34 Brigade, Lavrinenko, assigned as an observer, watched the mathematics of industrial warfare play out with brutal clarity. The Sherman battalion, outnumbered but fully operational, established defensive positions, while the T-34 Brigade's surviving tanks scrambled to cover gaps left by frozen comrades. When German Tigers appeared, their 88mm guns capable of destroying any Soviet or American tank at range, the Sherman's radio coordination. By March 1943, as the last German forces surrendered at Stalingrad, the transformation in Soviet attitudes toward American tanks had spread beyond individual units to Red Army command levels. The operational statistics compiled over 6 weeks of winter combat told an irrefutable story that ideology couldn't dismiss. Sherman-equipped battalions maintained average operational readiness of 81% during the coldest months. Comparable T-34 battalions averaged 52% readiness during the same period. The difference wasn't marginal. It was the gap between effective fighting force and broken formation. Soviet tank commanders began requesting assignment to Sherman units, a reversal so complete it embarrassed political officers who had spent months denouncing American equipment. Guards Colonel Dmitri Osadchi, commanding the 5th Guards Tank Brigade, submitted a formal report to front headquarters in February that would have been unthinkable 3 months earlier. American M4A2 tanks demonstrate superior reliability in extreme winter conditions. Radio equipment in all vehicles enables coordination impossible with current T-34 communication limitations. Request priority allocation of additional Lend-Lease armor. The request was approved, quietly, without the political education sessions that had accompanied initial Sherman distribution. The human cost of reliability became undeniable through crew survival statistics. Sherman crews fighting in tanks with 5 escape hatches, spring-mounted seats that absorbed impact, and spacious interiors allowing rapid evacuation survived tank losses at rates exceeding 7. T-34 crews, struggling through 2 small hatches in cramped interiors, survived at rates barely exceeding 50%. Soviet tankers, initially dismissive of American comfort features, recognized that padding and space translated directly into survival. Junior Lieutenant Viktor Karpov, a T-34 veteran who transitioned to Shermans in March 1943, wrote in his diary, "I mocked the soft seats and extra room. Then I survived a hit that would have killed me in a T-34 because I could escape through the loader's hatch while fire blocked the turret." American engineers understood what we refused to admit. Dead tankers can't fight tomorrow. The radio advantage that seemed trivial in training exercises proved decisive in fluid combat. Soviet formations mixing Shermans with T-34s developed hybrid tactics where Sherman commanders directed T-34 movements through radio, compensating for the Soviet tanks' communication poverty. This improvised solution worked so well that by April 1943, Red Army doctrine formally incorporated it. Tank company commanders were assigned Shermans specifically for the radio capability, using American equipment to control Soviet tanks more effectively than Soviet equipment alone allowed. The irony wasn't lost on tankers who'd been taught that American technology was inferior. The maintenance revolution transformed Soviet armored operations as fundamentally as combat performance. American spare parts arrived in comprehensive kits with detailed installation instructions translated into Russian. Soviet maintenance crews discovered they could replace a Sherman transmission in 8 hours using standard tools and clear procedures. Comparable T-34 transmission replacement required 16 hours, field expedient methods, and often failed anyway due to parts scavenged from other damaged vehicles. By spring 1943, Sherman battalions were spending 60% less time on maintenance than T-34 battalions, while maintaining higher operational readiness. The mathematics were inescapable. American engineering reduced the hidden cost of armored warfare. German intelligence, monitoring Soviet radio communications and interrogating prisoners, noted the shift with concern. A Wehrmacht intelligence assessment from March 1943 stated increasing Soviet use of American M4 tanks has improved their coordination and operational persistence. The reliability of American equipment in winter conditions exceeds Soviet domestic production. This development partially negates our technical advantages in tank quality. The report recommended increased focus on destroying Soviet logistics to deny them American supplies. Tacit admission that Lend-Lease equipment was proving more effective than German propaganda claimed. The strategic impact extended beyond tactical victory. Every Sherman operating on the Eastern Front freed Soviet industrial capacity to focus on quantity rather than quality improvements. Soviet factories could produce more T-34s faster when they didn't need to engineer solutions to problems American designers had already solved. The 4,102 Shermans eventually delivered to the Soviet Union represented only about 10% of Soviet tank strength, but their disproportionate impact came from reliability that multiplied effective combat power. A force that's 85% operational fights as if it's 60% larger than a force that's 55% operational. Soviet tanker memoirs written decades after the war consistently acknowledged the Shermans' contribution despite official Soviet histories minimizing Lend-Lease impact. Dmitri Lavrinenko, who survived the war and became a tank instructor, wrote in 1978, "We arrived at Stalingrad believing Soviet tanks were superior to all others. The winter of 1943 taught us that reliability matters more than specifications, that coordination multiplies strength, that crew survival enables experience, and that American engineers understood these truths before we did." The T-34 was a magnificent weapon. The Sherman was a better tool for winning a long war. The production statistics that became available post-war revealed the full magnitude of American industrial contribution. In 1943, the United States produced 29,497 tanks of all types, while the Soviet Union produced 24,089 tanks and Germany produced 10,000. American capacity alone exceeded German and Soviet production combined, and America was fighting a two-ocean war while maintaining civilian prosperity that Soviet citizens couldn't imagine. The casual abundance that produced Shermans for Lend-Lease, while equipping American forces worldwide, demonstrated industrial power beyond Soviet comprehension. By late 1943, Soviet requests for Lend-Lease armor increasingly specified Shermans over other available types. British tanks offered through Lend-Lease were often declined in favor of American models. Soviet maintenance crews preferred working on Shermans because parts arrived regularly and procedures actually worked as documented. Soviet tankers preferred fighting in Shermans because they started reliably, communicated effectively and brought crews home when hit. The transformation from contempt to preference took less than a year, driven by undeniable operational reality. The cultural impact was profound and largely unspoken. Soviet tankers had built identity around toughness, deprivation, and stoic acceptance of hardship as necessary for victory. The Sherman demonstrated that comfort and effectiveness weren't opposites, but complements, that well-rested crews fought better than exhausted ones, that reliable equipment reduced casualties more than thicker armor, and that systematic engineering could solve problems that Soviet doctrine accepted as unchangeable. These lessons challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between suffering and strength. German forces facing Soviet armor in 1944 and 1945 encountered increasing numbers of Shermans and noted their impact. A captured German tank commander told interrogators in June 1944, "The Americans' greatest contribution to Soviet effectiveness isn't the tanks themselves, but what they represent: logistics that work, spare parts that arrive, fuel that's available, and ammunition that's plentiful." When Soviets fight in American tanks, they fight with American supply confidence that makes them more dangerous than technical improvements would. The psychological impact of reliable equipment extended beyond mechanical advantages. The Shermans' legacy in Soviet service continued beyond Germany's surrender. Some Lend-Lease Shermans remained in Red Army service through the late 1950s, long after they were obsolete by specifications, kept operational because they still ran reliably when maintained. Soviet post-war tank design incorporated lessons learned from Sherman experience: more attention to crew ergonomics, improved vision devices, recognition that reliability multiplied combat effectiveness. The T-54, developed in the war's final years, reflected American influence in ways Soviet designers rarely acknowledged publicly, but clearly understood privately. The final accounting of the Sherman's contribution to Soviet victory defied simple quantification. The 4,102 tanks represented roughly 12% of Soviet armor strength, but their impact exceeded their numbers through superior operational readiness, enhanced coordination, and improved crew survival. Soviet historians' reluctance to emphasize Lend-Lease contributions during the Cold War obscured but couldn't erase the reality that Soviet tankers experienced directly. American industrial support had been decisive at critical moments when Soviet production alone might not have sufficed. The Shermans that arrived at Murmansk in 1942 and 1943 helped sustain Soviet offensives during the period when German forces were most dangerous and Soviet industrial recovery remained incomplete. May 9, 1945. Berlin. Victory Day. Guards Lieutenant Colonel Dmitri Lavrinenko stood beside his Sherman tank in the ruins of the Reichstag, watching Soviet soldiers raise the red banner over the shattered symbol of Nazi power. His tank, the same M4A2 he'd commanded since March 1943, had traveled from Stalingrad to Berlin, over 3,000 kilometers of combat through Ukraine, Belarusia, Poland, and finally Germany itself. The odometer showed 4,200 kilometers. The engine, those twin General Motors diesels he'd once dismissed as inferior to Soviet engineering, still ran smoothly. The same engine, the same transmission, 26 months of continuous operation. Around him, other tankers gathered near their vehicles, Soviet T-34s and American Shermans sitting side by side in the defeated German capital. Captain Alexei Berda, now a major commanding a tank battalion, approached carrying 2 tin cups and a bottle of vodka liberated from a German command post. "To the end of the war," Berda said, pouring generous measures. "To survival," Lavrinenko replied, raising his cup. They drank in silence, watching smoke rise from burning buildings across the city. Lavrinenko's crew emerged from the tank men who'd been with him since Stalingrad, who'd survived because the Sherman's 5 escape hatches had saved them twice when German shells penetrated their armor, who'd fought from the Volga to the Elbe in a machine they'd once called a parade float. "Do you remember what we said when these arrived?" Berda asked quietly. "American toys," capitalist, luxury. We were fools. Lavrinenko touched the Sherman's hull, metal warm from the engine that had never failed him. We didn't understand. We thought toughness meant suffering. We didn't realize that soldiers who aren't exhausted fight better, that tanks that start every morning win more battles, that talking to your comrades isn't luxury but survival. A young lieutenant, newly assigned and curious, approached respectfully. "Comrade Colonel, is it true you fought in this same tank since Stalingrad?" "Since January 1943, Lavrinenko confirmed. "Over 2 years, through winter, spring, summer, through mud and dust and snow. It started every morning." The lieutenant looked skeptical. "But I heard American tanks were inferior to our T-34s. Berda laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Inferior? I commanded T-34s at Moscow. I commanded Shermans from Stalingrad to Berlin. The T-34 is a great tank, fast, powerful, revolutionary. But the Sherman brought me home. Every single time, in this war, that mattered more than anything." Lavrinenko thought back to that frozen January morning, to watching helplessly as his T-34 refused to start while American tanks saved Soviet positions. "We judged by specifications," he said. "Gun caliber, armor thickness, top speed. We didn't judge by what actually wins battles. Starting when needed, coordinating with comrades, bringing crews home alive so they gain experience. The Americans understood these things before we did." His gunner, Senior Sergeant Viktor Petrov, who'd been with him since Moscow, added his own perspective. "I survived 3 T-34s being destroyed under me, lost friends in every one because we couldn't escape fast enough. In this Sherman, we were hit twice. All 5 of us walked away both times. The Americans built it to keep soldiers alive, not just to kill enemies. That's why we're standing here today." The statistical summary Lavrinenko had seen at the final headquarters briefing told the story in numbers. Sherman battalions in Soviet service, 4,102 tanks total delivered. Average operational readiness, 82% throughout service. Crew survival rate, 76% when tanks were lost in combat. T-34 battalions comparable period. Average operational readiness, 58%. Crew survival rate. The Sherman hadn't been superior in armor or firepower, but it had kept more crews alive and more tanks fighting, and in the arithmetic of industrial warfare, that decided everything. A convoy of American trucks rolled past, Studebakers bringing supplies to Soviet forces occupying eastern Berlin. The young lieutenant watched them, perhaps beginning to understand that the thousands of American vehicles keeping Soviet armies supplied represented the same philosophy as the Sherman tanks: reliable, maintainable, built to work rather than to impress. "Will we keep them?" the lieutenant asked. "The American tanks?" Berda shrugged. "Some, perhaps. But after this war, who knows what politics will decide?" He paused, choosing words carefully. "What matters is what we learned, that reliability is a choice, not an accident. That crew survival multiplies effectiveness, that talking to each other wins battles. These lessons came from America wrapped in steel. We should remember them, regardless of what happens to the tanks themselves." As evening fell over ruined Berlin, Lavrinenko walked around his Sherman one final time, running his hand along the hull that had protected him from Stalingrad to the Reichstag. He thought of the thousands of Soviet tankers who'd made the same journey in T-34s, the friends who hadn't survived because their tanks had failed at critical moments or couldn't escape when hit. He thought of the American factory workers who'd built this machine, who'd never met the Soviet soldiers whose lives their work would save, who'd probably never know their contribution mattered as much as any soldier's sacrifice. The telegram in his pocket, received that afternoon, informed him that his brother, a T-34 commander, had been killed in the final battles for Berlin. His tank had broken down during an attack. The crew had been caught in the open when German forces counterattacked. Lavrinenko thought about how reliability wasn't just a statistic, but the difference between brothers who came home and brothers who didn't. "The Americans didn't just send us tanks," he said quietly to Berda. They sent us a lesson about what industrial power actually means. Not biggest guns or thickest armor, but the capacity to build equipment that works consistently across thousands of kilometers and dozens of battles. We won this war through courage and sacrifice, but American industry gave us tools that made our courage more effective and our sacrifice less necessary. Berda nodded slowly. Do you think they understand, the Americans, what their tanks meant to us? Probably not, Lavrinenko admitted. To them, 4,000 tanks is a small fraction of what they produced. To us, it was the difference between advancing and stalling, between experienced crews and constant replacement of dead men, between victory and something much more costly. The red banner snapped in the wind above the Reichstag, symbol of Soviet triumph. But standing beside an American tank that had brought him from the Volga to the Elbe, Lavrinenko understood that victory had required more than Soviet determination. It had required American industrial support at the moment when Soviet production alone might not have sufficed. History might remember the T-34 as the tank that beat Hitler. Lavrinenko would remember the Sherman as the tank that brought him home. Someone should write this down, the young lieutenant said, so future tankers know what really happened. They won't believe it, Berda replied. They'll read specifications and conclude the T-34 was superior. They won't understand that the best tank isn't the one with the best numbers, but the one that starts every morning, talks to its comrades, and brings its crew home alive. As night settled over Berlin, Soviet tankers gathered around fires built from German furniture, sharing stories of battles fought and comrades lost. Lavrinenko listened to veterans debate which tank was better, T-34 or Sherman, arguing over armor angles and gun penetration, as if those numbers captured the full truth. He didn't join the argument. He learned that the best tank was the one you survived in, and his Sherman had brought him through 2 years of war when so many T-34 crews hadn't made it through 2 months. The war was over. Soviet forces had conquered Berlin. The Great Patriotic War had ended in total victory. But the Americans' contribution, minimized by propaganda that preferred to emphasize Soviet self-sufficiency, would remain in the memories of tankers who'd fought in Shermans. They knew what official histories might not acknowledge. American steel had saved Soviet lives. American engineering had multiplied Soviet effectiveness. American industrial capacity had helped turn the tide when German forces were strongest and Soviet resources stretched thinnest. Lavrinenko climbed into his Sherman's commander's cupola one last time, feeling the worn controls, smelling the familiar mix of oil and metal, running his hands over radio equipment that had kept him connected to his comrades through battles where isolation meant death. Tomorrow the tanks might be collected for return to depots. Politics might dictate that Lend-Lease contributions be forgotten or minimized. But tonight, a Soviet tank commander who doubted American tanks at Stalingrad sat in one in Berlin, alive because American workers had built a machine that kept working when it mattered most. The lesson wasn't about American superiority or Soviet inadequacy. It was about what industrial democracies could achieve when fully mobilized. Not just weapons, but reliable weapons. Not just tanks, but tanks that brought soldiers home. The Sherman hadn't won the Eastern Front. Soviet soldiers had done that with their blood and determination. But American Shermans had made Soviet victory less costly and more certain. In war's brutal arithmetic, that was everything.